November 12, 1944. The transport truck rattled down a dirt road in rural Louisiana, carrying 54 German women toward an uncertain future. Charlotte Muller pressed her face against the wooden slats, watching pine trees blur past in the fading afternoon light. Her stomach growled, a sound so familiar she barely noticed it anymore. None of them talked about the hunger. It had become as constant as breathing, as ordinary as the gray uniforms they wore. The women sat in silence, their faces gaunt and pale despite months of travel. Charlotte was 23 years old but looked older, her cheekbones sharp beneath skin that seemed stretched too thin. Beside her, Petra Schumann clutched a small cloth bag containing everything she owned in the world: a comb, a photograph of her mother, and a carefully folded handkerchief embroidered before the war when there was still thread to spare. They had eaten that morning, if it could be called eating. A slice of dark bread that tasted like sawdust, a thin smear of margarine that wasn't really margarine, and ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. Charlotte remembered when coffee was coffee, when bread was soft and white, when butter was yellow and rich. That was a lifetime ago, before rationing turned meals into mathematical equations of survival. The truck slowed, turning through gates marked with American flags. Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs. She had been told many things about Americans during her service in the Women's Auxiliary Corps. She had been told they were cruel, wasteful, and barbaric. She had been told their country was weak, their soldiers undisciplined, their civilians soft, but mostly, she had been told they were the enemy, and enemies did not show mercy to prisoners. The truck stopped. American guards in crisp uniforms approached, their faces unreadable. Lieutenant Ruth Anderson stood at attention, clipboard in hand, watching as the women were helped down from transport. Charlotte noticed the lieutenant's uniform was clean, pressed, and fit properly. Her own gray dress hung loose on her frame, sized for a woman who no longer existed. The camp stretched before them, rows of simple barracks surrounded by fencing. It looked neither welcoming nor threatening, simply functional. Charlotte had expected worse. She had expected brutality, deprivation, perhaps even starvation. Instead, she saw organized efficiency and something she couldn't quite identify in the faces of the American personnel: not hatred, but something closer to professional detachment mixed with what might have been curiosity. Anneliese Fischer, at 28, the oldest in their group, whispered in German, "At least we're still alive." Charlotte nodded. Survival had become the only measure of success. They had survived the war, survived capture, survived transport across the Atlantic in a ship's hold. Now they would survive whatever came next. What Charlotte could not have known, standing in that Louisiana camp with an empty stomach and lower expectations, was that survival was about to take on an entirely different meaning. Morning came with unexpected gentleness. No shouting guards, no harsh bells, just the soft sound of someone knocking on the barracks door. Charlotte woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was. Petra stirred in the bunk beside her, eyes wide with the same confusion. They had slept in actual beds with thin mattresses and wool blankets, a luxury they had not experienced in months. Corporal Vincent Morales opened the door, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Breakfast in 20 minutes, ladies," he said in slow, careful English. "Mess hall, straight across." He pointed, then left without waiting for acknowledgement. The women looked at each other, silent questions passing between them. Breakfast. They had assumed there would be food eventually, but so soon, and announced with such casualness, as if feeding prisoners was simply routine. Charlotte dressed quickly in her worn uniform, splashing cold water on her face from a basin. Around her, the other women moved with the mechanical efficiency of people who had learned not to expect much from any day. Young Helene Krauss, just 19, tied her blonde hair back with shaking fingers. She had been in the Women's Corps for less than a year before capture, barely old enough to understand what she had joined. The walk to the mess hall felt surreal. November sunshine filtered through Louisiana pine trees, warm despite the season. The air smelled different here, rich and humid, nothing like the sharp cold of German autumns. Charlotte noticed American soldiers moving about the camp, going about morning duties with relaxed efficiency. No one seemed particularly concerned about the German prisoners walking freely across the compound. The mess hall door stood open. Charlotte entered first, the others following close behind. What she saw made her stop so abruptly, and that Petra bumped into her back. Long tables were set with metal trays, but it was what sat on those trays that stole her breath. Scrambled eggs, pale yellow and steaming. Strips of bacon, crispy and glistening with fat. Toast, actual wheat bread, sliced thick with pats of butter melting into golden pools. A glass of milk, white and fresh, beating with condensation. Charlotte heard a small sound escape from Petra's throat, something between a gasp and a sob. Annalise stood frozen, staring at the food as if it might disappear if she blinked. Helene's eyes filled with tears she tried desperately to hide. This was not prisoner rations, this was not even soldier rations. This was food they had not seen since before the war turned Germany into a nation of hungry ghosts. Sergeant Dave Richardson stood near the serving line, watching their reactions with something that looked like understanding. "Go ahead," he said quietly, gesturing toward the trays. "It's for you. All of it." Charlotte moved forward on legs that felt unsteady. Her hands trembled as she picked up a tray. The eggs were still warm. The bacon smelled like a memory from childhood. And the milk, when she finally lifted the glass to her lips, tasted like everything she thought she had lost forever. Charlotte sat at the long wooden table, staring at her tray as if it were a puzzle she needed to solve. Around her, the other German women did the same, forks hovering uncertainly over food that seemed too good to be real. Petra was the first to taste the eggs, bringing a small forkful to her mouth with visible caution. Her eyes closed. A tear slipped down her cheek. She chewed slowly, deliberately, as if memorizing the texture and flavor of something she thought she would never experience again. That single tear broke the dam. Helene began eating with trembling hands, trying to maintain dignity while her body demanded she consume everything in sight. Annalise cut her bacon into precise small pieces, a habit from years of making meager portions last longer. Charlotte lifted her toast and bit into it. The butter was real, the bread was soft. Her throat tightened with emotion she had no words for. Sergeant Dave Richardson moved between the tables, his presence calm and unhurried. He had seen this reaction before from other prisoners, this disbelief at American abundance. He noticed how carefully they ate, how they tried to hide their desperation, how their sunken faces betrayed months or years of inadequate nutrition. Private Joe Bennett emerged from the kitchen carrying a large pot, and the smell that followed him made every German woman look up simultaneously. Coffee. Real coffee. Not the bitter acorn substitute they had choked down for years, not the chicory blend that tasted like earth and regret, but actual coffee made from actual beans. The aroma filled the mess hall, rich and dark and impossibly nostalgic. Charlotte felt something crack inside her chest. She remembered Sunday, mornings before the war, her mother brewing coffee in their Hamburg kitchen, the whole apartment filling with that exact scent. That life felt like it belonged to someone else. Joe Bennett began filling cups at each table, his movements efficient but gentle. When he reached Charlotte's table, he paused. "Cream and sugar?" he asked, gesturing to the containers at the table's center. Charlotte stared at him. Cream, sugar, choices, luxuries. Things that had disappeared from Germany so long ago that young Helene probably did not remember them. She nodded, unable to find English words or even German ones. Joe poured her coffee and moved on, leaving her holding a cup of something that smelled like home. Petra lifted her cup with both hands, breathing in the steam before tasting. "Charlotte," she whispered in German, "this is real. They are giving us real coffee." Annalise closed her eyes as she drank, her expression unreadable. Around the mess hall, 54 German women sat in stunned silence, drinking coffee and eating food they had not expected to see again in their lifetimes. And slowly, carefully, the understanding began to grow that perhaps everything they had been told about Americans was a lie. If they lied about this, Charlotte thought, What else was false? What other truths were waiting to be discovered? 3 weeks passed in a haze of disbelief. Charlotte woke each morning expecting the abundance to end, certain that yesterday's meals had been an elaborate deception. But breakfast came again, and lunch, and dinner. Meat appeared on their plates twice daily. Fresh vegetables accompanied every meal. The portions were not merely adequate but generous. Her uniform, which had hung loose on her frame upon arrival, began to fit properly again. Her face filled out. The hollow darkness beneath her eyes gradually faded. Petra gained weight faster than the others, her young body desperate to rebuild what years of deprivation had stolen. She laughed more now, a sound that startled Charlotte the first time she heard it. Young Helene no longer looked quite so fragile, though she still ate with the careful precision of someone who could not fully trust the plenty. Annalise remained cautious, always finishing every bite on her plate but never taking seconds, as if abundance might be punished. On a cold December morning, Lieutenant Ruth Anderson called an assembly in the recreation room. The women gathered, curious and slightly anxious. The lieutenant held up a photograph, one that had apparently been circulating in German propaganda newspapers. "I want to show you something," she said, her voice measured. "This was published in a German paper 3 months ago. It claims to show starving American children waiting in bread lines." She passed the photograph around. Charlotte studied it carefully. The image showed thin people standing in a queue, their faces gaunt, their clothes shabby. The caption underneath read in German, "America's weakness exposed. Their people starve while their leaders make war." Charlotte had seen similar images before, had believed them without question. Americans were supposed to be suffering, desperate, weakened by their own greed and poor leadership. She looked around the mess hall where they sat. She thought about the breakfast she had eaten 2 hours earlier, pancakes with real maple syrup, sausage links, fresh orange juice, and that precious real coffee. She thought about yesterday's lunch, roast beef, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, and apple pie. She thought about the Americans she had observed, the guards and kitchen staff and officers, none of whom looked even remotely hungry. Petra spoke quietly in German. "They lied to us." It was not a question. Annalise nodded slowly, her face troubled. "About everything," she added. Helene looked confused, her young mind struggling to reconcile what she had been taught with what she was experiencing. Charlotte felt anger rising in her chest, hot and unfamiliar. Not anger at the Americans, but at those who had sent her here believing lies, fighting for leaders who had built an entire nation on deception. Lieutenant Anderson collected the photograph. "I am not showing you this to mock you," she said gently. "I am showing you this so you understand. What you were told and what is true are two very different things." Charlotte met the lieutenant's eyes and nodded. She was beginning to understand that the real prison had not been this Louisiana camp. The real prison had been the lies. Late November brought cooler weather to Louisiana, though nothing compared to the bitter German winters Charlotte remembered. The camp had settled into routine. The women worked in the laundry, helped in the administrative offices, and some assisted with meal preparation under Chef Raymond Butler's supervision. The work was not difficult, and the compensation came in the form of continued food, shelter, and something Charlotte had not expected: respect. Sergeant Dave Richardson treated them as workers, not enemies. Private Joe Bennett told stories about his family farm in Iowa while peeling potatoes alongside Petra. Even Corporal Vincent Morales, whose parents had fled Mexico seeking opportunity in America, shared his mother's journey with the women, drawing unexpected parallels between their displacement and his family's immigration. Charlotte found herself laughing at Joe's jokes, understanding more English every day, feeling almost normal. On the morning of November 23rd, Lieutenant Anderson gathered everyone in the mess hall for an announcement. Charlotte noticed the Americans seemed excited about something, an energy in their movements that felt almost festive. The lieutenant smiled, a rare expression that softened her usually professional demeanor. "Tomorrow is Thanksgiving," she explained, speaking slowly so the German women could follow. "It is an American holiday where we give thanks for what we have. We celebrate with a special meal. Petra whispered a translation for those whose English remained limited. The women exchanged glances, uncertain what this meant for them. Would they be excluded from this celebration? Given separate rations while the Americans feasted? Lieutenant Anderson continued, seemingly reading their concerns. You will join us for the meal. All of you. Chef Butler has been planning something special. Chef Butler stepped forward, a large man with kind eyes and flour perpetually dusting his apron. He walked to a chalkboard and wrote in careful letters, "Banana pudding." Charlotte stared at the words. She knew pudding from her limited English lessons, a dessert of some kind. But banana was unfamiliar. Around her, the other women murmured in confusion. Annalise frowned, trying to place the word in her memory. Young Helene looked completely lost. Sergeant Richardson noticed their confusion. "Bananas," he said, gesturing a curved shape with his hand. "Yellow fruit, sweet, grows in warm places." He looked at Chef Butler. "When did you ladies last see a banana?" The question hung in the air. Charlotte searched her memory. Bananas had disappeared from German stores in the late 1930s, perhaps earlier. They were tropical, expensive, impossible to obtain once war disrupted trade. She had been a child the last time she tasted one, maybe 11 or 12 years old. Petra spoke quietly. "I was 15. At my cousin's birthday, before everything changed." Annalise shook her head. 1937, I think. Maybe 1938. Helene simply looked bewildered. At 19, she had no memory of bananas at all. The fruit existed only in stories told by older relatives about better times. Charlotte felt a strange anticipation building. Tomorrow they would taste something most of them had not experienced in 6 or 7 years. Tomorrow they would discover what Americans considered special. Thanksgiving morning arrived with golden sunshine, an air that smelled of roasting meat and baking bread. The mess hall had been transformed overnight with decorations the American soldiers had created, paper turkeys, autumn leaves cut from colored paper, and handwritten signs reading, "Give thanks," in English. Charlotte entered with the other women, overwhelmed by the abundance already visible on serving tables. A roasted turkey sat at the center, larger than any bird she had seen in years. Bowls of mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes with marshmallows, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce, and fresh rolls crowded every available surface. But Chef Butler had insisted everyone wait for one particular moment. After the meal, after plates had been filled and cleared, after the women had eaten until their shrunken stomachs protested, he called for attention. "Now," he announced with obvious pride, "the banana pudding." He disappeared into the kitchen and returned carrying a large glass dish. The contents gleamed under the mess hall lights. Layers of creamy custard, sliced fruit, vanilla wafers, and peaked meringue, toasted to golden perfection. Chef Butler set the dish down and picked up a whole banana from a crate beside him. Charlotte stared. The fruit was bright yellow, curved, perfect. He peeled it slowly, demonstrating the process. The white flesh inside looked impossibly fresh. He sliced it carefully, each piece falling onto a small plate. "Who wants to try?" he asked. Nobody moved. 54 pairs of eyes fixed on that simple yellow fruit as if it were treasure. Petra stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. She walked to Chef Butler with steps that seemed uncertain, dreamlike. He handed her a slice. She held it in her palm, staring at it. Charlotte watched her friend's face transform through a cascade of emotions: wonder, disbelief, memory, and grief. Petra lifted the banana slice to her mouth. She bit down. Her eyes closed. Tears spilled down her cheeks instantly. "Mama used to buy these," Petra whispered in German, her voice breaking. "Before everything. She would slice them for breakfast with cream. I had forgotten. I had completely forgotten what they tasted like." She stood there crying, holding a piece of fruit, and suddenly other women were standing too, moving forward. Annalise took a slice with shaking hands. Helene accepted one with wide, curious eyes, tasting banana for the first time in her remembered life. Chef Butler began serving the pudding itself, spooning generous portions into bowls. The custard was rich and smooth, vanilla-scented and sweet. The cookies had softened into the cream, creating layers of texture. The meringue melted on the tongue. Charlotte took her first bite and understood why Petra had wept. This was not just dessert. This was proof of a world that still existed somewhere beyond war and hunger and loss. Around the mess hall, German women sat with bowls of banana pudding, many crying openly now. They cried for the years without sweetness, for the childhoods interrupted, for the simple joy of tasting something beautiful. Private Joe Bennett stood near the kitchen, his own eyes damp. Sergeant Richardson looked away, clearing his throat. Even Lieutenant Anderson blinked rapidly, maintaining composure with visible effort. The days following Thanksgiving felt different. Something had shifted in the camp, a barrier crumbling that neither side had fully acknowledged existed. The banana pudding had done what months of coexistence could not. It had revealed that German prisoners and American guards shared the same capacity for joy, for memory, for tears over something as simple as dessert. Charlotte noticed conversations beginning where before there had been only polite silence. Petra started helping Private Joe Bennett in the kitchen every morning, her English improving rapidly through their constant dialogue. He taught her American cooking terms while she described German dishes from her childhood. "My Oma made Apfelstrudel," she told him one morning, her hands busy peeling potatoes. "Apple strudel, yes? The dough so thin you could read newspaper through it." Joe listened with genuine interest, asking questions, writing down her grandmother's techniques in a small notebook he kept in his pocket. Corporal Vincent Morales found himself in longer conversations with Annalise, who asked him careful questions about America. She wanted to understand how the country worked, why it was so different from everything she had been taught. "My parents came from Veracruz with nothing," Vincent told her during an evening guard shift. "My mother cleaned houses. My father worked construction, but they could send me to school. They could own their house. America gave them a chance." Annalise listened intently. "In Germany we were told America exploited immigrants, used them like slaves." Vincent shook his head. "Not slaves. Workers. There is dignity in work when you are paid fairly and treated with respect. My parents were poor, but they were free. That mattered more than wealth." Charlotte, overhearing this exchange, felt another piece of propaganda crumble in her mind. Young Helene spent hours with Sergeant Dave Richardson, who had begun teaching a formal English class in the evenings. She absorbed vocabulary with desperate hunger, as if language itself could rebuild the world she had lost. "Why do you help us?" she asked him one night, struggling with English pronunciation. "We were enemies. We fought against you." Dave considered the question carefully. "You were never my enemy, Helene. You were a kid who got caught up in something terrible. Teaching you English costs me nothing. Maybe it gives you a future. That seems worth doing." Charlotte sat in the recreation room that evening, watching these interactions multiply around her. Petra laughing at Joe's impression of his grumpy rooster back home. Annalise and Vincent debating the meaning of freedom. Helene practicing English phrases with exaggerated care. The camp no longer felt like a prison. It felt like something else entirely, something she had no German word for. Community, perhaps. Or possibility. Mrs. Dorothy Mitchell arrived that week as part of a church outreach program, bringing books and magazines for the women. She spoke with Charlotte about life in Louisiana, about forgiveness and second chances, about how people could change if given the opportunity. "You girls aren't who you were when you arrived," she said kindly. "I can see that clearly. Question is, who do you want to become?" December brought the first mail delivery from Germany since the women's capture. Lieutenant Anderson distributed letters in the recreation room, calling names from a short list. Only 18 women received anything. Charlotte's name was called. Her hands trembled as she accepted the thin envelope, recognizing her sister Margareta's handwriting immediately. Around her, other women clutched their own letters, faces reflecting hope and dread in equal measure. Charlotte waited until she was alone in the barracks to open hers. The paper was rough, cheap, wartime quality. The ink had smudged in places. Margareta's usually neat script looked shaky, hurried. "Dearest Charlotte," it began, "we received word through the Red Cross that you are alive and well in America. Thank God. We had feared the worst. Charlotte's throat tightened. She continued reading. Conditions here are worse than I can properly describe. We are surviving on potatoes when we can get them, turnips when we cannot. The bread ration is 200 grams per day, and it is more sawdust than flour. Mama has lost so much weight I barely recognize her. Little Hans asks constantly when real food will come. He is 7 now, and has never known abundance. He thinks hunger is simply how life is supposed to feel. Charlotte stopped reading, pressing her palm against her mouth. She had eaten roast chicken for dinner 3 hours ago, mashed potatoes with primus, real butter, green beans, a slice of pie. Her stomach was full, comfortably full, and her little nephew was starving 7,000 kilometers away. She forced herself to continue. The bombing has destroyed most of Hamburg's center. Our apartment building survived, but the windows are gone. We cover them with cardboard and cloth. Winter is coming, and we have no coal for heat. Father's health is declining. The doctor says malnutrition has weakened his heart, but there are no medicines anyway. Charlotte, I do not write this to burden you. I write so you know what awaits if you return. There is nothing here anymore. Nothing but rubble and hunger and grief. Across the barracks, Petra sat on her bunk reading her own letter, tears streaming silently down her face. Anneliese had crumpled hers, pressing it against her chest. Helene, who had received no letter at all, watched the others with hollow eyes. Charlotte folded Margaretha's letter carefully and placed it under her pillow. She walked to the mess hall, even though it was not mealtime. The kitchen was empty, except for Chef Butler, preparing tomorrow's breakfast. He looked up, saw her face, and simply nodded toward the coffee pot. Charlotte poured herself a cup, adding cream and sugar with mechanical precision. The coffee was hot and real and perfect. She thought about Hans, 7 years old, asking when real food would come. She thought about her mother's shrinking frame. She thought about her father's weakening heart. And she thought about the impossible guilt of being a prisoner who ate better than her own family. She had no idea how to reconcile these truths. Spring arrived in Louisiana with azaleas blooming and air heavy with humidity. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Church bells rang across America while in the camp, the German women received the news with complicated emotions. Victory meant defeat for their homeland. Liberation meant return to devastation. Freedom meant facing everything those letters had described: hunger, ruins, grief, and uncertainty. Lieutenant Anderson called an assembly in late May to discuss repatriation procedures. The women gathered quietly, their faces reflecting months of internal struggle. Charlotte sat beside Petra, both of them having talked late into the night for weeks about the decision that loomed before them. Around them, other women fidgeted nervously, whispering in German about what returning home would actually mean. "Ladies," Lieutenant Anderson began, her voice gentle but official. "The War Department has finalized arrangements for your return to Germany. Transportation will be provided within 6 weeks. You will be processed through displaced persons facilities in Europe before release to return to your families." She paused, studying their faces. "I know this brings mixed feelings. For those who have families waiting, I hope you find them well. For those facing uncertainty, I wish you strength." Charlotte felt Petra's hand grip hers tightly. This was the moment they had planned for, rehearsed in whispered conversations. Charlotte stood slowly, her legs unsteady. "Lieutenant Anderson," she said in careful English, "may I speak?" Permission was granted with a nod. Charlotte looked around at the other women, seeing her own fear and hope reflected in their eyes. "Some of us wish to request something unusual." Her voice grew stronger. "We wish to ask if we might stay in America instead of returning immediately to Germany." The words fell like stones into still water. Lieutenant Anderson's expression shifted to surprise. Sergeant Richardson, standing near the door, straightened visibly. Chef Butler, who had been observing from the kitchen entrance, stepped forward with interest. Petra stood next, followed by Anneliese, then Helene. 11 more women rose slowly until 15 stood together. "We know Germany is our homeland," Petra said in halting English. "But the Germany we left does not exist anymore. The Germany we served was built on lies we never questioned. Here, as prisoners, we have been treated with more dignity than we showed others. We have eaten when our families starve. We have found kindness where we expected cruelty. Annalise spoke next, her voice steady despite visible emotion. My letter from home said there is nothing to return to. My city is rubble. My family is dead. But here I have found work that matters. I have learned that enemies can become friends. If America will have us, we wish to stay and build lives that honor the second chance we have been given. Young Helene added softly, I do not remember peace. I only remember war and hunger and fear. Here I have learned what peace feels like. I want to help build peace, not return to ruins. Charlotte watched Lieutenant Anderson's face process this unprecedented request. Prisoners asking to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom. It defied all protocol, all expectation, all logic. 10 years later, Charlotte stood in her own kitchen in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, preparing dessert for her family. Her 2 children, Emma and Thomas, played in the next room while her husband Robert read the evening newspaper. She pulled out a glass dish and began assembling layers with practiced ease. Vanilla wafers, sliced bananas, custard she had made from scratch following Chef Butler's patient instructions, and finally meringue beaten to stiff peaks. As she worked, Charlotte remembered that Thanksgiving in 1944 when she first tasted banana pudding as a prisoner of war. She remembered Petra's tears, Annalise's shock, Helene's wonder. She remembered how a simple dessert had shattered every lie they had been taught about America. The propaganda had claimed Americans were weak, cruel, selfish. But a nation's true character revealed itself not in how it treated friends but in how it fed its enemies. The transition from prisoner to immigrant had been difficult but possible. Lieutenant Anderson had advocated tirelessly for their cause. Mrs. Dorothy Mitchell and her church had sponsored several women, providing housing and employment connections. Chef Butler had written letters of recommendation. Sergeant Richardson had testified to their character and transformation. Private Joe Bennett's family in Iowa had sponsored Petra, who now worked in a bakery teaching German recipes to curious customers. Of the 15 who had requested to stay, 12 had successfully navigated the complex immigration process. Annalise worked as a translator for the State Department. Helene had gone to nursing school and now worked at Charity Hospital in New Orleans. 3 had eventually returned to Germany, feeling pulled by duty to help rebuild, but they carried with them stories of American kindness that helped heal old wounds. Charlotte slid the banana pudding into the oven to brown the meringue. Through the kitchen window, she could see her neighbors' children playing, hear their laughter mixing with her own children's voices. Emma was 7, the same age Hans had been when Margarita's letter described his constant hunger. But Emma had never known hunger. She had never known fear. She knew only the abundance and safety that America offered those willing to embrace its ideals. Robert entered the kitchen, wrapping his arms around Charlotte from behind. He had been a supply officer at the camp, one of the Americans who had quietly supported the women's unprecedented request to stay. "Smells like Thanksgiving," he said, kissing her cheek. Charlotte smiled, pulling the perfectly browned pudding from the oven. "It smells like home," she corrected. That evening, as her children ate banana pudding and asked for seconds without understanding what a miracle that simple request represented, Charlotte thought about the choice she had made a decade earlier. She had chosen truth over propaganda, hope over despair, future over past. She had learned that home was not just a place you came from, but a place you chose to build with intention and gratitude. The banana pudding had taught her that America's greatest strength was not its military power or economic wealth, but its capacity to transform enemies into citizens, prisoners into neighbors, hatred into hope, one spoonful at a time.